Okay, so on the show today, the legend that is Andrea Olsen. It's funny, I've been very much aware of her for quite a while, but I think this is the first time we've actually connected, so I've been looking forward to this. I've read one of her books. She's an author, movement teacher, performer, lots of different hats. They've been doing somatic stuff for a long while, so definitely someone worth listening to. Yeah, Andrea, welcome.
Well, thank you, Mark.
So you are in Maine.
Northern Maine, border of Canada.
And how did you get interested in the body? Can we kind of go right back and sort of hear the beginnings of your story?
Sure. Well, let me say to start with, I've been looking forward to this conversation with you too, Mark. It feels like an intentional conversation is a kind of a journey. And the pleasure of that is you have no idea quite where you'll end up. So to start, how did I get into this? I think I could mark one or note one key moment in junior high when Mr. Barlow was a science teacher, and he had us turn the pages of our science text, and there were the organs. This was a little like you weren't supposed to really teach this in Illinois then, and definitely not in Florida, where I was also in school. But I lived on a farm in central Illinois, and we can talk about that. But the horizon was flat, rich black soil. And my dad was an artist as well as a farmer, but he would chop the heads off chickens. Chickens would hop around during blood. He'd pluck the chickens. We'd go down in the basement, and as a child, I would help eviscerate the organs. So I knew the feeling of a hard sporullic heart. I knew the feeling of these small intestines. I knew the gizzard. I had no idea they were inside me. So this moment in seventh grade with Mr. Barlow kind of discovering that human body was my body, and it was similar to the animal bodies on the farm, was my first step, I think, into a love of anatomy, calling it a love of anatomy. Then there were many phases along the way, but I just wanted to note that one because that link between what you're taught and what your experience is.
Right. This is key. When I first became aware of your experiential anatomy work, the Body Ways book, I've done quite a lot. Really recommend that book. Done beautiful pictures, very practical, very accessible. Done a bunch of the exercises in that book. Is it Body Ways, the brown one? It was a few years ago that I worked my way through it.
BodyStories.
BodyStories. Excuse me. I've moved house and I was trying to find it. Headed in somewhere in the cupboard. But a few years ago, I worked my way through it. Really enjoyed it. And this idea that we can be taught about things and then even experience them in the outside world. And that's different from inner experiencing, right? That's a whole nother way of knowing that isn't so common generally.
And I remember, Mark, when another grade school memory, early school, somehow those early experiences stay so strongly, before I went to first grade, I was standing at my child desk, blue desk in the hallway next to the closet with all the discarded dolls. And I promised myself that I would not forget what I knew when I started school. I don't know why I thought that, but there was always this disconnect for me between what people are telling me is important and what my own experience has been. So I also mark that or note that experience as one of those intuitions that moves through you at different ages in your life that you just know is true, but you don't know why or what it means till you get much older.
And what were your sort of main studies in the movement, dance, embodiment world?
I started as a painter. I made my living as a dancer by selling paintings. Now that's an unusual.
Okay, right around, yeah.
And so I fell in love with anatomy at graduate school with Dr. John Wilson, and that was at Utah. he taught anatomy as philosophy, the multidimensionality of the human spirit, made it a big topic. But it was still something you studied, and wasn't until Bonnie Cohen, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, we always name our mentors, that it was my body, it was my pelvis, it was my leg, it was my foot. And then working with good friend Janet Adler, colleague Janet Adler in Authentic Movement, realizing that the body could tell me much more than I could tell it. So I better learn how to listen deeply. And then it goes on. More recently, qigong with Lee Holden, energy. In all of my books, I've written 4 books, and in all of them, I never used the word energy because it was so new age.
Yeah, it could be considered a bit heavy. Yeah.
Yeah, and also as an academic, because I taught, in a university for 3-4 decades, you had to use language that was specific. And energy is different in different disciplines, whether you're talking to a physicist.
What are we talking about here? Yeah.
So anyway, more recently, Mark, I've assisted a very close dance friend through hospice and through the process of dying. And in that discovery, this word energy that we use is not a metaphor. It's real. We watch it go part by part from the body. So I have a whole different relationship to what energy is, as something we cultivate, as something we understand in ourselves. Often when I perform, or even in a conversation, because I'm sort of an introvert, so it takes some work to get those inner experiences connecting outward. But there's this energetic exuberance that comes, I feel it now, and it's not nervousness. It's more of a sense that there's something trying to move through and connect that's larger than my conscious mind can grasp, and how do you access it and open to it. And performance has always been an opportunity to play with that, explore that. It's both terrifying and satisfying at the same time. That duality is always part of my experience. Standing with everything on that borderline with what you don't know, that edge zone, or we call it ecotone in environmental studies. What you don't know, and that's the juicy terrain that can keep you uncomfortable your entire life, which is exactly what we do as artists. Look for that uncomfortable edge, right? And see what else you don't know.
You've written several books. I know you've got a new one. We can definitely talk about that. But more broadly, the process of sort of embodied writing, what does that mean? Because many people would think of writing as a kind of cerebral process. You have thoughts, you put them down on a piece of paper. How does the body kind of come into writing?
It's a good question, Mark, and a long exploration, I think, for me. The BodyStories book simultaneously, that was in the 90s, so it was quite a while back, but I was studying Vipassana meditation, where you do a body scan, you go part by part through the body, notice sensations. With Goenka, S.N. Goenka, one of the main teachers, very powerful experience. And I was also doing a women's writing group. It was actually a shared writing group, it wasn't gendered. And the leader, Doug Anderson, had been a Vietnam medic. And so you didn't write fluff when you were in the writing group. You're always digging for really the part of the story that was compelling. So how those two come together was that I discovered that every part of the body had stories stored in it. So if I were studying the skull, there would be all these stories of myself when I was a child in all of these various beauty pageants. My mother entered me in a lot of beauty pageants.
Okay.
I really got to perform being cute for a long time. Had to really work to get that to go somewhere else. So there were a lot of stories about phase. There are a lot of stories about when I got to my shin, this, young man I kicked in second grade, and I felt so bad about it. So this understanding that the body was full of stories, and part of that created an aversion to certain parts of my body, fondness of certain parts, like my hand. But that inhabitation part by part is also a house cleaning. It's like once those stories get conscious, are spoken, are shaped, are shared, that they don't hold the same intensity in that part of my body after that. So in my teaching, I always had students write their body history, the story of their body from pre-birth to where they were at this point, whether it was 20 or 40 or wherever. And sometimes the page, they would be 40 pages of stories. They were pre-Olympic athletes. They'd had 13 surgeries by the time they were in college. And so this sense that the body, the tissues hold our memories. But that was, once I kind of got that in BodyStories, I finished that process. It takes 10 years. Anytime I write a book, I always think it's 3. Always takes.
Wow, to 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, you're faster than I am, but.
No, I don't know. It's probably 10 years to write the first one, and
no, you're young. You've got some more in there.
Nice to be called young, Andrea. Yeah. Thank you. But the body story side's fascinating, though, isn't it? Because most people see the sort of body as a physical thing. It's a construction, it's like a robot or something. But there's this way that meaning is just layered within us. There's so much there. In even something like your shin, you might think, oh, what's the story there? But there's loads that can be going on for people. Mm-hmm. And there's a reclaiming of that, isn't there? When you kind of bring that to light consciously, that I think is very powerful.
It's a reclaiming, and it's sort of an emptying, oh, well, what else? And my thought when I'm writing a book, if there's, if you're not changed by the time you finish a book, it's not done.
Right.
And there's also the Robert Frost statement, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. So what do you discover in a book? So the first book was really me discovering.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Stories. Yeah. I had to be surprised in the writing. I write to discover. I don't write to tell what I know.
Yeah. I definitely write to get clearer about ideas. I think certainly my first book had almost like a therapeutic process. I was like there's a few little personal stories in it, and I had to sort of structure how does my life fit together in this way? Certainly develops the work, doesn't it, as a body of work to get it as clear as it needs to be in a book. I would think, oh, this is pretty clear already.
Yeah.
But by the 10th draft, it was several times clearer than it was at the beginning.
Yeah. And hopefully you have a good editor or several of them that challenge those terminologies and things that you come up with. But once it's done, I find it hard to talk about those topics. I feel like I hear myself saying what I already wrote.
Right. Done now. Dead now.
So what's next? So, the next one was Body and Earth. And it was like, I moved to a wildlife sanctuary. I got married. I was surrounded by natural scientists, people who were either biologists or geologists or whatever. And so all of a sudden, I realized, the body's in a context.
Right. I was going to ask you about this. Yeah. Like, what is that out the window? Is that an apple tree?
Yes, we got an apple tree. Yep.
The gardener in me can still see that. And like I always ask people before they go, like, where are you? And some people are like, why do you care? We're on Zoom. And I'm like, no, it makes a really big difference where you are.
And I like seeing the real place, not the false screen behind.
Well, I've got a screen. I can show you behind that. It's just the cupboard. But, there's not pizza boxes, a few dead rats. There's nothing.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Like, it's nice to see people's houses and their context. Zoom
Yes.
puts us into each other's houses. So say more about how place impacts our embodiment then, because that seems to be one of your main areas.
Yes, I think I'll start with this one story. When I was writing Body and Earth, or before I was writing Body and Earth, I was teaching in the environmental studies program at Middlebury College, and wonderful colleagues. Bill McKibben was there next door, John Elder, brilliant writers and thinkers, as well as teaching in the dance program. But I applied to a conference to teach about body and ecology. And I got a transcript back, or a response back, that said, there is no science proving that body has anything to do with the environment. It's an interesting idea, but that there's no research behind it. And I thought, oh, really? Well, I better write a book about that, because there is a lot. So the science of the body, which you and I have studied and we know deeply, partnered with the science of earth systems, that the body is water, and that we do breathe air created in dialogue with plants. It's so obvious, but it was not being taught in environmental programs. So that book leans heavily on the science of interconnectedness between humans and the environment, which now is sort of old hat. But at that time, you weren't allowed to teach about the body in connection to the...
I guess eco-psychology has become established as a discipline, and the Japanese have got the studies on forest bathing and these kind of things. It's become I wouldn't say old hat, but it's become a bit more established. Kind of, I talk about eco-regulation. All my Ukrainian students are like, hey, I'm going to eco-regulate. No, it sounds much more scientific than I'm going for a walk in the woods because it feels nice. So I'm glad that there's a science base there that's developed, but it's sort of common sense for almost anyone that's spent time in nature, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of assumptions we have about all of those things. By the way, Mark, BodyStories is being translated into Ukrainian.
Great. Well, let us know. I'll send it to some people there.
It'll take a while, but it's I love how these books can be shaped in different languages, so that people teaching embodiment practices in their home language don't have to just use terms that we've created in English.
It's a real thing how to translate embodiment. My Spanish students tell me it sounds religious in Spanish. In Russian, they often just say embodiment. They're just using they actually just use an English word because it's not quite a word for it. The Germans have their word. Working in Europe, it became an issue very quickly. Like, okay, we have to be careful here when we're working across linguistic barriers.
But just going back to your question about place, the impact of place, going back to living on a farm. So the Midwest in the United States, I don't ever been in Illinois, but it's flat, black soil. And my embodied memory, one of the many, is standing in a field and twirling. And I could touch the horizon line with my fingers in all directions. I can do it right here.
Nice.
And I knew that I could go anywhere. And so that was sort of an embodied understanding of being local, being located somewhere, but anywhere in the world was available, or any kind of persona was possible.
But that horizon, and I grew up in East Anglia, the east of England, which is similar to Kansas or somewhere, fields of corn to the horizon. And that sense of horizon is quite special, isn't it? Like for me, that leads to an expansiveness. I remember a couple of times we had relatives from the city who came to stay. We swapped houses for a week, and they went a little bit crazy though, because they weren't used to so much space. Freaked them out a little bit. They weren't used to the dark at night either, growing up in the countryside. And these are quite profound things to be impacted by.
When I went to graduate school in Utah, we were surrounded by mountains, and it's a gorgeous landscape, Salt Lake City, but I felt depressed. I couldn't figure out what was wrong.
Claustrophobic. Yeah.
Oh, I see. It's mountains. Just go to the top of the mountain. You'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, I had that experience in the Alps. Why is there stuff in the sky? And my brain on some level didn't like it. Yeah.
And then, we would migrate every winter to Florida, my whole childhood. So we would farm and garden in the summer, and then we would go to Florida in the winter. And that embodiment really was about the ocean and the undertow and the power of the ocean, almost drowning, being pulled under once, and that sort of panic, that this huge force that you're inside of that can kill you, and then popping up and surviving it, but realizing how small humans are in relation to the larger natural world was, and still is, part of my passion for being near an ocean when I write.
Have a nice bit. Did you have a hurricane recently there? I think my PA said that you might have had bad Wi-Fi. It looks like it's fine, but was there something recent?
Coming up the coast, it's supposed to go to Nova Scotia.
Just brushing by.
We had tornadoes in Illinois, so I knew that, but I was never directly in one. So I think that was probably the first embodied sense of, I can die in relation to this beautiful thing we call nature. It's also
it's lethal as well, huh?
Yeah, and that's the range that we live in as art makers, or in religion too. You can disorient yourself so much in the creative process that you can lose your ability to come back and be centered and move around town like an ordinary human being. So these states of disorientation that we invite sometimes in embodiment, in dance practice for sure, in creative work, also in religious, spiritual practices, how to come back and synthesize and integrate and communicate with others. I think I learned a lot about in the discipline of authentic movement with Janet Adler, which she now calls the discipline of authentic movement. When I was first studying and being with her, it was authentic movement, capital A-M. There's different layers of that. But basically, when I teach it, often it's the process of entering a state of eyes closed movement. We can do this in a minute if you'd like. And then returning to be conscious and communicate with your larger community and with yourself. It's very shamanic in that way. It's not just about going and getting lost somewhere.
Is there a risk for those of us who are sort of deeply into embodied practice of being lost in ourselves, being too much in our experience, somehow that disconnecting us, sort of everything from communication problems to walking in front of traffic to just being a bit sort of wrapped up in oneself? Is that a potential risk for our kind of disciplines?
I think, the skin to depth inside, skin to depth outside, it really is a balance between your connection inwardly and ability to connect outwardly all the way to the cosmos. I mean, it's not just who you're sitting next to. These the ability to change lenses and time scales has always been helpful to me. Yeah.
In terms of lenses and time scales, then, so talking to someone else today, it's come up with a few people, just the idea that there's a lot of uncertainty. And some of my Ukrainian friends, it's, will we be nuked? It's pretty serious uncertainty. You're old enough to remember that in the US, I guess, in terms of Cuba and things like that. But right down to economic uncertainty, difficulty with travel plans, because, COVID's still around and countries get closed down, and trips get cancelled still. Like, the context we're in now feels significantly different than 5 years ago, significantly more chaotic, I would say. What might be some potential helpful shifts in embodiment, perspective, tuning in and out, given this sort of very uncertain, chaotic context in the world?
It's sort of the question we're all tapping on right now, isn't it? How can these practices we've developed all these years be of use in this moment, in this context? I do feel like the practice of arriving, daily, moment by moment, being present is helpful. Feeling our feet on the ground, remembering that we're breathing, deepening breath, connecting past the head spin, fear cycles, in whatever way we do. Finding colleagues that we can communicate with. But I agree, it's a time where this practice of disorientation, where we've done for so long, in terms of what I mean by that is like disorienting the conscious mind enough that it lets the body speak. You know, like there's only a certain amount of that the conscious mind can be aware of at any moment. So letting go of that's what I call the boredom theory of body work, where you have to quit trying so hard to experience something, and then 2 hours later you're actually feeling the liver move in yourself, and then the next time you want to contact that experience, it's almost instantaneous, but there's this surrender into time and exploration. That's part of it. All those practices we're applying, but I think my era is sort of passing. You're more on the bridge between what's going to be and what's been done in the body, in the embodiment years.
There is a passing of a generation of teachers, isn't there? Like if I think of sort of the senior teachers of different fields, they're kind of old. And not in a bad way. It's good to have elders. I found out one of my teachers was very, very seriously ill just in last week. And, I look at other mentors and think realistically, probably not going to be here in 5 years, And I'm curious, I started off as a sort of enfant terrible kind of young up and coming teacher. And now I'm the establishment. So how did that happen? Now there's another generation of teachers on TikTok doing trauma dances and things, 25-year-olds, and I feel like an old man. It's like, how's that happen? So like anything on this sort of generation, I see sort of almost like 3 generations of embodiment teachers sort of artificially. There's people I've taught, my generation, who were taught by your generation primarily. Any thoughts on that movement there through the generations? It's
I think it speaks to the question you had of, what's useful now. What, as an elder, is it useful to do or say? Like, are we done with my stories or with my practice? Or is there something still to be discovered and shared in that? But also, of course, just as you are, how to support those who are now on the front line, basically, of exploring. Is that an appropriate word? Keeping these dimensions in play. I do feel that one of my most compelling explorations has been the ability to change lenses, whether you're shifting to an environmental lens or to an embodied lens or to a gender lens or to a cosmological lens, like not to get stuck in one way of experiencing the world. In some ways right now, it seems like people get stuck more easily. Like, oh, this is who I am, this is what I'm saying, I'm gonna go down this pathway. And
it's become highly politicized, the embodiment world. It's become highly politicized. The generation under me, will have a very strong stance on a position because it's almost a religion. Actually, it's got a very strong political angle to it quite often, I'm noticing, which I don't remember being there so presently in my generation, and maybe was there differently in your generation in terms of the 60s, peak movements, things like this.
Well, before we were outsiders, and I think we kind of liked being outsiders. Uh-huh. Nobody was watching carefully. You could really explore and make some mistakes and get your little group of people to have creative dialogue with, and then build through time an awareness of what you're trying to share.
Things can go, I mean, we're interested in the inner world of somatics, right? And it strikes me that things can get much more external very quickly now. Like I can record a video on this phone of me doing top tips of embodiment for stress or whatever, and I can put it on 3 social media channels and reach God knows how many people instantaneously. There's an externalizing, and also it seems like everyone's their own sort of PR person these days. It's just sort of everyone's their own small business marketing team on top of it. This is something about how it's a little trickier to really go in the modern context.
And yet we all still long for intimacy in some ways. I mean, we're cultivating it even in conversation. But a sense of that you've really been somewhere with someone.
Yeah, people are longing for that, for sure. For sure. Your latest book's on communication, right, as well? That's the latest topic?
Yeah.
How did that emerge out of what we're talking about?
Well, I'll just tell you, I write about what I want to know, what I'm not good at. So I basically danced because it was silent, and then I wrote because I could edit my words, and now I make films so I can see what I'm feeling, looks like what I'm doing, looks like what I think I'm doing. So a book on communication came out of international passion, my sense of place, even though it was very localized. Dancers toured in the 70s and 80s. So, I did solo tours in Asia and South Korea, and I was a resident in New Zealand and Africa and South America and up there in Iceland. And I say that because the view became global. And that level of communication, recognizing that the body is so central. My most intimate duet was walking into a studio in China, and a young man was dancing to a piece of music, and he took my hand and we did this incredible duet with lifts and falls. We never said a word, and then the music stopped and I walked out and it was over. So this understanding of how powerful embodied communication is. But when I taught at the Middlebury Institute, my very first class, I was trying to bring embodiment into global studies there. It's a wonderful place, people from all over the world, graduate students. But a woman very, very irritated with me said, "What does the body have to do with communication?" If I wanted to study the body, I would have gone to a graduate school in biology. I need practical ways. And so I'm thinking, oh my heavens, what about communication doesn't include the body?
Right, yeah, where to start?
And again, the same thing. There was no book. There was no research. When I tried to teach it as a course, it was turned down several times, embodied communication, by the committee, because there was no books proving that experiential embodiment had anything to do with serious study of communication. So those blocks, feeling when someone says no, I love that. Gives me something to push against, motivates a book.
Right. Oh, right. Okay. So no. I'm gonna have to write. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, really? Can't do that? Okay. Let me tell you what I should. So that was the inspiration. I couldn't quite figure out how to teach it well in that context. I wasn't in a studio anymore. We were behind desks with computers and cell phones, and all of the media interfering between me and what I was trying to teach. So that was the source of that book, but it really essentially came from my travel internationally and understanding that we're in a global world, all the way, again, skin to depth, but skin to depth outside too. We have to understand and interact at an embodied level in these international communication scenarios. It seems so important.
It definitely informed me. I think it's a bit of a blind spot for a lot of the teachers from the States. It's nice to hear you've traveled so much and had a lot of these experiences, and it's yeah, now even more so. It's you know, just talking to someone from Ethiopia yesterday, you know, and I'm like, okay, this is someone in the sauna in the gym just from Ethiopia, you know. I'm like, okay, like we're sharing a conversation. Like I've been to Ethiopia, but you didn't used to bump into Ethiopians in England. It wasn't a common thing, and it could have been someone from 100 other countries in that sauna. That's so normal now. And then online, you know, there's a young lady from Japan studying with us currently online. And it's like, okay, I'm glad I've been to Japan. I'm glad I've felt Japanese art. I'm glad I've got some sense of that embodiment, even though it's one of those embodiments that's kind of got a lot of mystery in it. But yeah, super important.
That is one thing I also learned, Mark, that I like to pass on, is that all of my assumptions about a place were wrong when I arrived there.
Right. Okay. Give an example. Give an example. Like what?
Well, it started in France. You know, I studied French in high school, and then I spent my junior year abroad in France. It wasn't anything like so sensual and powerful, and they'd been through the war, and they'd just been through the 1969 riots, and you know, just the taste, the smells, the sound, the living the language, so different than studying about it. And then that's true. You know, when I'm in Asia, that feels so comfortable to me. Japan, not all of Asia. The audience in Japan, they came to me afterwards because it's often, at least modern dance, very ritualized. If you have a chair on stage, you spend a day polishing it because it becomes a sacred object.
Okay.
Then they took me upstairs, a special dinner, silence after performance, recognizing you're coming back from a transformative experience, serious questions about it. And then they said, you dance like we dance. And I thought, oh, you know, it's more of a ritualized exploration, even though I was trained in Graham and
Yeah.
these wonderful artists, but they also did a 2-year tour of Asia. It's very that the Asian aesthetic, and there, I know it's not all Asia. There's multiple.
Big place, yeah.
Yeah, very distinct. But they traveled in those different countries. And Ruth St. Denis and Ted Sean, which was part of what Arthur Graham was part of, and Jose came from there. So that's in martial arts. It's very much, you know, Aikido is very much under there. It's kind of like a return to the source in some ways. So I'm, you know, the point there is those countries are not what I was told they were. And
so this, yeah, I sometimes I give the difference in experience, you know, like I studied Aikido for 20 years before I did it in Japan. And in my first class in Japan, I went, oh, that's what they're getting. Not any spectacular secret ninja technique or something. I just was like, that's what they're kind of aiming for with this, you know, different kind of knowing. It was like, I kind of looked at that from abroad for a long time, but glad I had those just very few experiences like Aikido in Japan, just to taste it, as it were.
And I think that's how I experience mentors too, Mark. And I think this may be one of the roles that we elders have now. My major mentors were not people I was trying to, they weren't trying to teach me something, they were transmitting something. Merce Cunningham, when I was in high school, just standing in a huge gymnasium, but very close to me. I never felt someone who could focus and give attention that way. You know, so it wasn't his technique, it was his presence that was transmitted. And I feel like each of the practices that I've been deeply involved in through my whole life, the mentors transmit something, and then that my mind scrambles to figure out what it is, you know. So anyway, I'm sure you've had that experience also, but the Aikido story is similar to that, where it kind of comes in at a different level than you're learning about it.
Do you want to guide us in a little experience? Obviously, people listen to this, maybe driving, walking down the street, whatever, but those who can, would be lovely to have maybe finish with an experience, and then we'll send people to where they can find out more.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to share my very favorite one. We'll see if it's too complex or not, but you're game for it, I'm sure.
I'm up for it. It's been a long week and a bit of embodiment. It's yoga after this, bit of embodiment practice with an elder and a master such as you, Andrea. I like you very much, and yeah, this is a real treat. So go for it.
Well, we're starting just what we're doing. We're starting as human beings sitting, and we're just noticing that we're human beings sitting. This is a practice called thresholds, and I do it in different languages, but we'll do it in English for right now. Thresholds, sitting. So the threshold is the part of the doorway that you step over to enter another room or another place. So we're going to invite the threshold between sitting and moving. And what does that thought, what does that threshold bring for you, for anyone listening, that can invite being a human being moving? It might be exactly the same, might be not visible, might be large, whatever. Being a human being moving might be to you. And we could do that for 10 minutes or so, but we won't. We're going to invite the next threshold, which would be the threshold without stopping what you're doing, just noticing the threshold between moving and eyes closed moving, or authentic moving, letting the body tell you what it might like. Again, it might be the same as before, just noticing what those words bring. Authentic moving, or eyes closed moving. Imagining that we get to do that for a while, and then approaching the threshold between authentic moving, eyes closed moving, and dancing. Whatever that might mean, any kind of dancing. Maybe it's the same as you were just doing. Now we're human beings dancing. And then we're inviting the threshold between dancing, whatever that might evoke in you, stepping across that threshold through the doorway into what I love to call raucous dancing, or just kind of wild, free, unhinged dancing. And then imagining we had to do that for a while. Stepping across the threshold, or toward the threshold, through the threshold, between raucous dancing and performing. And we're going to imagine that performing means fully embodied awareness in movement with the intent to communicate. Performing, whether it's conversation, dance, photograph, video. We're just human beings performing in whatever way we do that in the world. And then inviting the threshold, stepping across the threshold between performing fully embodied consciousness with the intent to communicate into meditating. Fully embodied consciousness with the intent. Communicating with oneself or spiritual dimensions or energetic context. Meditating. We are just human beings meditating. And then embodying the threshold between meditating and sitting. And then if we were with a group, we would go through this, but people could call out the terminology in their own language and hear what sitting or moving or meditating sounds like in different partners. Thank you, Mark, for joining me on that journey.
Thank you. Very pleasant end to my working week. So yeah, feel a real treat. Andrea, we need to move towards a wrap up relatively soon. No rush. Is there anything that you would have liked to have spoken about or would have liked to have been asked about that we haven't covered?
I noticed.
Say again?
I think maybe a sense of humor, generosity. You know, when I'm teaching authentic movement, there's a dialogue between a witness and a mover. And one of the practices I like to do is to write down 3 qualities you would like in your witness. And you might think about that for a second, or whoever is listening might think. Qualities would you like to be met with in a non-judgmental but discerning witness state? And I can ask you, Mark, and then I'll share what mine were that surprised me. That's why I like to do it as an invitation. What did you come up with for that?
What I would enjoy in a witness.
Someone who was witnessing.
Oh, part of me at the moment just wants to be left alone and not looked at, if I'm honest. So probably one who was sort of private, respectful, something like that. Like I'm aware I'm about to go to a public yoga class and sometimes people will recognize me or say hello, and I kind of don't like that. So the sort of the witness I'm longing for right now would just be someone friendly, keeping a kind of respectful kind of distance. It's not always what I want, but right now that's what feels most alive.
No. I think what surprised me was that I did want someone with a sense of humor and slightly irreverent.
Well, I'm here, Andrea, no problem. Like, I think I've got that covered. I don't know if you've heard the rumors, but I think we can make work with that.
Anyway, thanks. Thanks for witnessing. Thanks for sharing a journey.
It was a pleasure. And it really was a pleasure, Andrea. You're a class act. And yeah, I kind of would love you to be better known out there, the sort of younger generation that might not be aware of your work. So where do they start? Like, where's the best place for them to go, to read, to study with you? Give us some options.
I think probably those 4 decades of books kind of walk you through my personal stories and hopefully invite the reader's stories. So that's the whole goal of the book, is to invite other people's exploration to take it the next place.
Great. And is there video content for those who like that? And if I search you on YouTube, I might find a bunch of stuff.
You know, a good place really, Mark, is the Body and Earth website, which is now translated in 9 different languages.
Wow.
It's 7 web-based excursions. So they're all things to do, but they people find them quite useful, and they're online and they're free.
Beautiful. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us today.